What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. I'm the host, Dustin Johnson, and you guys better buckle up. We are going to have an awesome time today. We're going to be talking about the book, The Maker versus the Takers. For those of you watching on Zoom, this is the book. Get it, read it. Author Jerry Bowyer. Jerry Bowyer is a financial economist, a public speaker, frequent radio and television guest, and an author and a journalist. He's also the only person I've ever seen use a Tableau dashboard in a sermon. So if that tells you anything about where we're going, get ready. So Jerry, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time. So thank you.
My pleasure. So let me tell you about a Tableau dashboard in a sermon. And I think that people tend to think of data as something that's for one group over here. Mm-hmm. And they tend to think of words and letters and scholarship, especially biblical scholarship, as in another group over here. But the word data comes from the Latin, which comes from the Greek, for the word givens, or you could translate them as gifts. So data is a gift. And all good gifts are from I thought you'd like that. All good gifts are from God. So data is a gift from God. So Tableau is just, we have Bible study aids that, to help us study our Bible, Logos, or the departed Bible works or whatever. Well, Tableau is just a portal. It's a God's mind study aid, just as a spreadsheet is, to help us see the design of God through the gift of data.
Yes, and I love the way that you've kind of married all of that in this book. And so before we kind of kick off into the details of the book and some of the aspects that you've written about, can you just give us an overview of what you do, what's your background, and what kind of convinced you to write this book?
I'm an economist. I'm a financial economist. That's my day job, which means I'm not an academic economist. It's fine to be an academic economist, but I work with money as opposed to classroom teaching. It's fairly quantitative what I do, in that it's mainly helping to create, if people are in the finance industry, they'll understand smart beta index products. So I'm involved in finding patterns and then telling funds, here are the rules to put in your algorithm that will maximize the probability of the investors in your fund reaching their financial goals. So it's fairly analytical, and that's what pays the bills. But throughout my entire career, going back really into my mid-20s, there's always been two tracks. There's always been a working with money track, whether it's as an accountant with a big six accounting firm or what I'm doing now. And there's always been this sort of thought leader communication, big ideas track. And sometimes one paid the bills and the other was more like the avocation. And another time this one paid the bills and this was the avocation. But those things have always been existing. So the things I do now, where I give speeches to financial advisors, groups of financial advisors mainly, or groups of CEOs or entrepreneurs, or just give guest sermons. That's that other track. But it's not how we keep the lights on around here. But it is how we try to keep the light on out there, the phos, the light of Christ, shining on the world of capital markets, where it should shine as much as it shines in our churches, but doesn't. So all the more need for it.
Yeah. And so I guess that's a perfect segue. Is that the reason you wrote this book? Is that what you felt like? Is that the thing that you were trying to address with this book? Was you're seeing in the church some kind of really, not to sound like really harsh or anything, but bad, terrible economic ideas being perpetuated in the church because of what they see in Jesus, in the Gospels. Is that kind of... No,
that would have been a good reason to do it. That would have been a better reason, I suppose. I did the research because I just wanted to know. Okay. My wife and I did this research because we wanted to know what Jesus thought about economics. We work in economics, and we're followers of Christ. And so why wouldn't we want to know what the second person of the Trinity thinks about the thing that I do for a living? I didn't really have any thoughts about writing a book. I I've I've learned over time it's almost a slightly cynical reaction that the best stuff sells the worst. So I thought if I'm going out there and trying to really figure out that what's going on, people won't be all that interested in it, and a book wouldn't sell. So it's not like I thought about a book and then rejected it. It's like I just kind of knew automatically this is not something I'd write a book about.
Okay.
And then a friend of mine who's in publishing reached out to me and said, I really want to do a book with you. And we talked about various topics that I had been working on. There were 3 topics we threw around. And this is the one he settled on. And he just talked me into it. He just,
Okay.
kind of kept asking.
Yeah.
And finally I said, okay, I'll write a book. So I wrote the book because I was nagged into it. I did the research because I really wanted to know the truth.
Okay. Okay. Great. And you've been actually working on this for a while. I think I heard you had a discussion with, was it Peter Lightheart on this? Like there's 2 discussions, I think,
Yes.
and they went pretty detailed, but that was a while ago. And I was like, this book is probably not that new. I mean, it's a new book, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say this book was about like actually working on, let's say the research. The research with me, I do a high proportion of research to writing. So the book was written quickly. The
Okay.
book was written in 9 months, but there's roughly 4 or 5 years of research behind that.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's another book I wrote, a master's thesis, which I haven't published. That was 5 years research and then 1 year writing. So that seems to be my pattern.
Okay. Yeah. I figured, just trying to put those pieces together. Okay. So let's dive in. So the way I'm thinking about it, the discussion, let's talk about the economics of the towns and the villages and the occupations of the people that Jesus encounters in the Gospels. Why is it important for us to know that stuff? What is it? How does it help us kind of understand what's going on in the Gospels?
Well, it's important because it's in the Bible, right? If it's in the Bible, then we know it's important.
Right.
There aren't any unimportant things there. And that's partly a statement of faith, but it's also partly a statement of just knowledge about ancient literature, in that ancient literature is detail oriented. It's not necessarily historically detail oriented like the Gospels are, but ancient literature is written very carefully because parchment was very expensive and scribes were very expensive, and you just didn't waste time. You
Yeah.
know, Stephen King novels can go 1,100 pages, because the pixels are free and the paper's cheap.
Right.
And he's too famous now to be edited. His earlier books, same thing with J.K. Rowling. With her books kept getting, the more famous she got, the bigger her books got because
Yeah.
they couldn't edit her. Well, that's not how ancient literature works at all. Ancient literature is like you're trying to narrow things down. You're telling the story, you're rehearsing it, and then we want to fit as much as possible. It's so expensive that if you ever actually look at ancient manuscripts like Greek, it's all the letters run together. There's no spaces between them. There's certainly no indentations, and there's no punctuation because you can't waste time on that. You can't
Right.
waste space on that.
Right.
So now the Bible, the Gospels, the Bible in general, yes, but the Gospels are true ancient literature, and they are very historically oriented. There are a lot of historical details in the Bible that we've gotten used to just skimming over. When Augustus was Caesar, when Quirinius, or before Quirinius, was proconsul in Syria. We get, like I'm talking about the Nativity passage, we get a lot of historical details.
Mm-hmm.
So for these gospel writers, in particular for Luke, these historical details are important. They don't register as important to us because we barely know who Caesar Augustus was.
Right.
And one Christian in maybe 1,000 has the slightest idea who Quirinius was. And so we skim over what we don't know what to do with.
Yeah.
And so historical details like that, geographical details, we don't know. A lot of Bible cities have names that start with Beth. That's beit in Hebrew, house. So something is the house of this or the house of that, right? Bethany, right?
Mhm.
Bethsaida, etc. They all just sort of sound the same to us over time. And
Yeah.
we don't know Capernaum. And Jesus is at a wedding in Cana. Okay, well, what's Cana? Does that have something to do with Canaanite? Or, or
Right.
probably not. And we maybe think about it a little bit, and then we get on to, well, there's a miracle. Let's go on to the miracle, which is the main point.
Right. What's the
But
application?
right, or the theory or the theology, but it matters that he was in Cana. By the way, this none of this is in the book. This is not at all. They didn't all make it in there. It matters that he was in Cana. Cana had an industry. It mattered what the industry was, and Jesus's miracle is relevant to that industry.
Mhm.
And wherever Jesus is going, his miracles and his, let's focus in on his economic commentary, are relevant to the particular setting. That's why
Yes.
details matter.
Yeah, and I heard you give this example that I thought was so profound. You were saying, when you read in the Gospels and it says something about a man came to Jesus, and it gives you details about where he's from, or kind of gives you the some small little detail. You were saying something like, it's like if I were telling a parable today, and I said, "Hey, I'm in uh, I'm in Silicon Valley, and I am talking to a guy next to a sports car with a hoodie on, and he's on his lunch break." You kind of get an idea of what this guy's profession is.
He's not a
He's
lawyer, probably.
right. He's probably in the tech industry, right?
Yes.
And so some of those details, I was like, wow, this will really bring that out. And you go into the book. In the book, you kind of pull out some of those details and how those details are intentional, and they're supposed to provide us with pieces of data that we are supposed to take and apply to that specific passage. Um, so talk to us about the difference between Galilee and Judea. What's kind of the concept that you've highlighted in this book? What's the difference between the two? What's the difference between the towns and the people within these two groups?
Galilee did not have as high taxes as Judea did. And this becomes a bone of contention later when Jesus is in Judea and they ask him about paying taxes to Caesar. Um, part of the background there is that Jesus hadn't had to pay that tax to Caesar because he lived in Galilee, and Galilee didn't pay the tax to Caesar. Um, so there's probably a little bit of, hey, this Galilean's probably a tax revolt guy. Let's trap him. Um, so they had a lower tax structure. It was a much newer economy, kind of an up and coming. So you could think of it as frontier, almost like entrepreneurially, America kind of moves west in terms of its entrepreneurial frontier, right?
Yeah.
I'm in Pittsburgh. There's a time when that was the western frontier. Now we're basically northeast or northeast Midwest. So there is a kind of a stretching out. So Galilee was a stretching out from Jerusalem kind of economy. It was a newer economy. Newer economies tend to be faster growth economies. It was a more decentralized economy. If you travel south, you would find gigantic farms that were essentially plantation farms. But up in Jesus's area, the farms tend to be like 15 to 40 acre farms, according to Finney's Christian Origins in the Ancient Economy. So archaeologically, we're finding kind of human scale farms, which means farms that are worked by the person who owns them. So you don't have the split between owning the asset
Gotcha.
and working the asset. So that's the very essence of an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur owns what he or she operates, as opposed
Mhm.
to, say, a publicly traded company where you start to get essentially stewards, and then you have a lot of stewards or bailiffs, sometimes in older translations in the Bible. Well, that wouldn't have been Jesus's area. That would have been down more towards Judea, where you have these gigantic farms, and somebody owns the farm, and the guy who owns the farm doesn't know a thing about farming. The guy who owns the gigantic farm owns it because he did a favor for Herod, or because
Okay.
he was a loyal soldier for Caesar and killed Caesar's or Herod's enemies. And so here, have a 100,000 acre farm. So
Right.
that was not the Galilean economy. The
Right.
Galilean economy was people refer to freehold farmers. You owned what you worked. So we have those farmers. We have builders like Joseph and Foster son builders, and we had a lot of building going on up there. It's a building boom very near to Nazareth in a town called Sepphoris. And we have a lot of shops. The observation's been made by at least one archaeologist that you dig up a village in Galilee and you find 2 or 3 shops in pretty much all the villages. So you have a shopkeeper society, a freehold farmer society, a builder society, and you have industrial. We have what we might call light industrial. You have industrial farming around Capernaum and Bethsaida. These, not just people going and catching fish and then eating their fish, but people catching fish, drying it, selling it around, exporting around the empire. The manufacture of hooks for sale, the manufacture of boats for sale.
Yeah.
And in Cana, you have the manufacture of stoneware. So you have light industry there, stone cups, stone water basins, etc. So you have a kind of a mix of agriculture, building, and some fishing and stoneware would be the main industries. Jesus, in Nazareth, the main agriculture looks like it was olives, but entrepreneurial owners owning.
Makers.
Exactly. Makers, creators of wealth, not extractors of wealth.
Yeah, and you kind of highlighted this in the book. We tend to think of where Jesus is from as like poor and kind of this backwoods kind of place, but you actually said no. Actually, Sepphoris itself was a wealthy place. It was a big place,
Yes.
and you talk about how like Jesus probably got his financial literacy from these trade routes that go through Sepphoris to the ancient Persia and Babylonian trade routes and all of that stuff, which I was super fascinating. But it kind of confronted my preconceived notions that Nazareth and Galilee were these like poor places that Jesus came from. He was a poor guy, all this stuff. But I don't think that's really the case when we look at the geography.
No, if I look at literature about ancient economics and I look at a skilled artisan, a tecton like Jesus, it depends on the setting, but and there are like standard scales of relative wealth by occupation in the ancient Mediterranean world. We're talking about someone who could really easily have been 85th or 90th percentile in terms of wealth. If I really want to stretch because I think that somebody's going to get mad at me for saying that, because it's like the health and wealth gospel or something. I mean,
right.
I can maybe, this is when Jesus is working. Now, when he leaves his job and becomes an itinerant preacher, we have different dynamics. I can maybe get Jesus, if he was like not a very good carpenter, maybe down to like 70th percentile of wealth distribution in his society. Not on the poor side, because skilled artisans weren't poor.
Right.
They weren't poor in general, and they especially weren't poor in Israel because it was a more respected occupation. The pagan Greek world didn't have much respect for the occupation of artisan. The Jewish world did. And on top of that, this is Herod's Israel. And Herod was the great builder. And then so were his sons and grandsons. So there's an incredible building boom. And what we find are in Josephus, we find references to Herod going out there trying to get people to become carpenters and stonemasons because there was such a shortage of them. So it's like, okay, you're not a stonemason. That's all right. We'll train you to be a stone. They had like a job training program because of a shortage of stonemasons and carpenters. And those were very related occupations. Carpenters worked with wood, but they worked with stone because when you built with stone, you built the framework out of wood. So these were overlapping occupations. So given the fact that while Jesus was a teenager, Sepphoris was being rebuilt, was a gigantic rebuilding process, then they would have been very highly in demand at that point. It's a building boom. And then when Jesus, almost as soon as that's done, they shift their attention and rebuild Tiberias, which was also pretty close to Jesus's hometown, although not as close as Sepphoris. They were neighbors. So Jesus in his late child years, and children work back then in teenage years and young adult years, lived through 2 building booms in an occupation, and his occupation was builder. So I think he'd be pretty upwardly mobile, not affluent in the sense he could just sit and collect dividend checks, but affluent in the sense that, a really good computer programmer. who's
Yep.
in demand, or another knowledge worker, because
Mhm.
that was the cutting edge right then. He was in
Yep.
the cutting edge technological area, and was certainly, well, I don't know about certainly. You had to go back. The case that he was poor would be a very weak one. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And you basically made the case that he most likely had the knowledge and the experience that provided the backdrop for some of these parables that he talks about. But before we get to the parables, when Jesus gets into Judea, one of the first people he approaches is the rich young ruler, right? And
Oh,
so,
or the rich young ruler approaches him, I believe.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
there's a conversation there between the rich young ruler,
right.
and those details, the rich young ruler, are
Yes,
are important. They're
yes.
important to tell something. We skip over it, but those are important. So why is that important? What's the thing going on there that you kind of highlight?
The fact that he's a ruler is extremely important. And this is one of these areas where I am frustrated with the church. A friend of mine told me that he heard a sermon once where the pastor said, think of Bill Gates, a rich young entrepreneur, someone who's very wealthy, and is an entrepreneur and is young. No, don't think of Bill Gates. Bill Gates wasn't a senator. Bill Gates
Right.
built something.
Mhm.
Now whether you like Bill Gates or not, that's a different question. Whether you like his politics,
Right.
um, I mean, he's very helpful to us right now on Windows, which
Right.
I'm using here. So it matters that he's a ruler. That's an essential part of the story. And why is it an essential part of the story? Because the pointy end of the stick of Jesus's hermeneutic, or sermon stick, is aimed at rulers who are using their political power to exploit people who aren't rulers.
Mhm.
Or if it's not rulers, it's people who are adjacent to rulers and have the favor of rulers, like the money changers or the tax collectors. So it really matters that he was a senator, an archon, a member of the Sanhedrin. He's young and he's a Sanhedrin member. Well, you didn't have, sometimes some city will elect an 18-year-old mayor or something like that. You didn't have that kind of retail politics. If you were young and you were on the Sanhedrin, you inherited
Yeah.
daddy's Senate seat along with his fortune. So this was an inheritor of a fortune and political power.
Yes.
And then there's this other little detail. I don't know if you remember, where he asks the rich young ruler asks what he needs to do to be saved, and Jesus recounts the commandments. Um, Basically the 10 Commandments, but Jesus adds a commandment: do not defraud, in the conversation with this young man. Do not defraud is not in the 10 Commandments. All the other commandments Jesus lists are in the 10 Commandments, but he adds one. Me aposter, I forget the personal ending, but do not, a prohibition against fraud. Why? Well, that's one of those details.
Yeah.
Why would Jesus? I'm going to assume this not because Jesus got confused about which commandments were in the 10 Commandments or not. That he knew what he was doing. He was a
I'm sure he probably knew.
good Hebrew student. He's a Bible. He'd memorized the 10 Commandments. The
Yeah.
Decalogue was important. So why does he add one? He adds one because he's talking particularly about the sin that's most relevant to this man's life. This
Yes.
man is a defrauder. That's why he's a rich young ruler and he's a defrauder. And it's almost like icing on the cake, because a rich young ruler would almost certainly have been a defrauder, because that ruling class was defrauding by nature. How do we know that? Because later on, Jesus's little brother James writes a letter, the Epistle of James, in which he castigates Christians for sucking up to the rich, reminding him that the rich, there in Jerusalem, that's where he's writing from, defraud you. Are these
Mhm.
not the ones who defraud you, who drag you before the judgment seats? So this is something that's emblematic of the class.
Yeah, and there's another example that you go into, which we won't get into now, just time because of time. But the differences between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. Everyone needs to get this book and just read the whole book. But that's a really key one that I thought was super eye opening. Um, okay, so from here we've talked about how the difference between Galilee and Judea, broadly speaking, is you've got north, you've got makers, creators of wealth, people who are honestly providing value to society, trading, commerce, all that stuff. And then down here in Judea, you've got this, a class of people that are takers, broadly speaking,
Yes.
extractors of wealth. That's how they
Yes.
get their money. And so that's
the ruling class. You had people in Judea who were taken from. You had oppressed people, but the ruling class of Judea, that was the economy kind of centered around the taking institutions. And the taking institutions would be taxing institutions that are purely political and taxing institutions through the temple. The temple was a quasi-political entity. So tithes and offerings were essentially a form of tax, and there was a lot of exploitation centered on the temple.
Yeah. Okay. Now I want to get into this parable. We'll just do one of the parables. This was the part of the book. This book took me. It's a short book, 150 pages. It took me forever to read because I kept having to put it down and chew on certain aspects of it. This one was one of the ones I was just like, oh my goodness. It's the 70 times 7, and he goes into the parable of the unfaithful servant, but you've actually titled it the unfaithful nation, and I want to talk about that because it's crazy. So everyone knows Peter comes to Jesus. He says, how often shall I forgive my brother? Seven times, or 7 times? Yeah. And Jesus says, you say 7 times, I tell you 70 times 7 times. And then he goes into this parable. He says, for this reason, and he goes into the parable of the unfaithful servant. Let's talk about this, because I've never read it this way, but it's fantastic. Okay, so what's the parable? What's the gist of the parable, and why is it important?
The parable is that a king forgives a servant a small amount of money, and a debt, because a debt, and then the servant turns around and tries to forcibly extract a much greater amount of money, a catastrophically high amount of I'm sorry, I have that backwards. The king forgives the servant an extremely high debt, and the servant, I should know this, I wrote a book about it. And the servant turns around and tries to squeeze out money from someone who owes him money. So his debt is forgiven, but he doesn't forgive the debt that he should.
Right.
And he's condemned for it, and he's handed over to the torturers. In that passage. So that's the basic of the parable.
Yeah, and okay, there's so many different places I want to go. The 10,000 talents. It says he was forgiven 10,000 talents. We brush over that and we think, okay, why is it so important that talent, that amount, that number is so high? It kind of gives us this sense that he's not talking about personal. He's hinting at national wealth or national output, right? And so when he's telling this parable on the personal level, it's almost like he's like me and you talking now, and I use numbers like $22 trillion in debt.
Exactly.
And you're going to be like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? That's not, I mean, obviously you're talking about the United States, the output of the United States.
Yes.
Right. Because that's the idea.
Right.
But that 10,000 talents is just an astronomically big amount. And it tells us that Jesus is actually talking about something bigger here.
Yes. It's 6 years of my estimation of the output of the territory under Herod Antipas's control.
Yep.
So, I mean, I have the math in the book. It's not all that complicated. You know the tax rate. Mm-hmm. So you take a base times a tax rate, and that gives you a tax revenue. Well, you can go the other way. You can divide your way into it.
Yep.
And so I'm whether that number is exactly right or not, because we don't know for sure what the tax rates were, but we know what ancient tax rates tended to be. And when taxes got too high, Caesar would come in and actually pressure local leaders not to raise taxes too high because it causes tax revolts. So there tended to be a ceiling in most of the territories. Now, like I mentioned, Judea had an extra tax. They were in trouble. They were being punished. So so it's the point is it's a macroeconomic number. And
Yeah.
so what I've heard are, liberal scholars saying, well, this is obviously an exaggeration. I've heard pietistic approaches being, if anyone, like some people, most people just skim over it. Sounds like a lot of money. I don't know how much, right? And then it just becomes, someone forgave you, you should forgive, God forgive you, you should forgive other people, which is perfectly fine pastorally, but it
Mhm.
doesn't really give us everything that's in the text. So
Right.
there's a tendency to say, then see how very sinful you are. If someone actually gets on Logos and looks it up or looks in their Bible dictionary and finds out how big a number it is, it becomes, see how incredibly sinful you are.
Okay. Yeah.
You owe 10,000 talents. You owe, thousands of times the average annual income. That's how bad you are. That's how much God has forgiven you. So feel very pious about that, because God has forgiven you, and feel good about that. Well, I guess that's, there's those good that brings forth good religious
Yeah.
emotions,
There's a
but I
circle
don't
of
think it
meaning.
is that. I don't think it's that this is a story about a guy who racks up, at the casino, a $20 trillion debt. I think it's a macroeconomic scale number because it's a macroeconomic discussion. Israel is the servant that did not forgive its servants.
Yes.
Israel, and that's why the 70 times 7 matters so much. And I've so many sermons about 70 times 7 is just Jesus's poetic way of saying a lot.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no. This was a very important number in Second Temple Judaism. So
Yes.
if you see someone with a T-shirt on and it says 1776, you don't say, 1,776 watts. Is that $1,776? Is that? No, this is someone who is aligning himself with the American War for Independence and the Declaration of Independence. We know those numbers. Christian, if you're in a Christian context and someone says 1948, oh yeah, 1948, Israel became a state. The prophetic clock allegedly starts ticking. Whatever. These numbers are right. These numbers are important. They're known.
Yeah.
Everybody was thinking about 70 times 7
Hmm.
because that was the prophecy in Daniel about how long the captivity to the foreign nations would last. The moment of their liberation, just like people who say 1776 are longing for freedom, people who say 70 times 7 are longing for freedom. They're longing to have their sin forgiven, which Jeremiah explicitly aligns with not forgive it with the not practicing the Shemitah rules.
Yeah.
So
The
Israel
sabbatical.
didn't let the
Yeah.
land rest. They didn't forgive the debts, and for that they were punished by sent into exile. And they think it's only going to be 70 years,
Hmm.
right? Because Jeremiah says 70 years. So how much should I forgive? Only 70 or only 7, like they thought? And then Daniel comes back with the bad news. No, no, no. You didn't
Oh.
use your 70 years well. It's going to be 70 times 7 that you're in exile. And everybody's got out their little secret decoder rings in the first century, and they're running their prophetic charts. And everybody knew something's happening around this time. We're getting
Yeah.
closer to the 70 times 7 to the 490 year when the Messiah would come and the debts would be forgiven and the pagans would be kicked out.
Yeah.
So that, and the fact that that question is asked of Jesus by Peter, Jesus answers the way he does, and then immediately rolls right into a parable about debt forgiveness
It
that
like
has
parallels.
macroeconomic numbers. What's that?
It parallels that exile narrative. Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's like two layers. He's telling the same thing. Like what has happened in history, he's telling in parable form. And that blew my mind. Like I was like, just seeing that, and the way that it highlights the idea that you've talked about, we've talked about in the show before, that parables they were not meant to explain things. They weren't meant to make things clear. It was meant to cover things up, but he's still talking truth here.
Yes.
And so, and you've got that little piece at the very end of that passage. He says he was handed over to the torturers. Well, we know 70 AD, Jerusalem is, proverbially speaking, handed over to the torturers when Rome came in
And so is the
tore
ruling
up Jerusalem.
class because they have gold, and so they want to get out of Jerusalem. So there's a rumor that the ruling class had swallowed their gold. swallowed gold coins,
Oh gosh.
so that they could, get out of Jerusalem. So if you're a Roman soldier who's had it up to here with these people, and your pay isn't all that great, and you catch a noble, and you're used to killing people for a living, and you catch a noble Jew fleeing from Jerusalem, and you've heard a rumor that they swallow gold to get out, what are you going to do? You're going to
You
do
get the
something
gold.
gruesome. You're going to get
Yeah.
the gold. And that's exactly what they did. So you have all these members of the ruling class who are ripped open, where the soldiers are looking for gold. They were
Gosh.
tortured. They
Yeah.
died torturously because they didn't forgive the debt.
Hmm.
What's the connection between that? Because in 66 AD, you have a debt revolt. So the debt had accumulated and accumulated and accumulated, to the point where some of the Sicarii, the dagger men, the radicals, the terrorists, went and burned down the House of Public Records. And Josephus did that. Said they did that to curry favor with the debtors because there were polos, there were many debtors. So this group basically kind of gets its first major violent act, assassination of the high priest and his family,
Hmm.
and then the burning of the House of Public Records to curry favor with debtors. So Jesus's warnings about debt had very practical consequences. I mean,
Yes.
their failure to listen to his warnings about debt had very practical consequences.
Yeah. And, you also have, and I don't know, I don't think you mentioned this in the book. I've heard this before, and it may not be correct, so take it with a grain of salt. But there's also someone told me that since the temple was built with gold, right? It's got gold kind of laid within the bricks and all that stuff. That, I mean, no stone will be left upon another,
Yes.
right? So
They're
Rome
looking
came
for
in.
gold, right? And
Yeah.
I've also read there's a common theory that there was a thought that maybe gold was hidden in the walls of the temple. So they're tearing down the temple bit by bit to get to the gold. I don't know whether
Yes.
that's true or not, but I've read that. It's plausible. It's worth digging into to see if there's a primary source.
Yes. Man, I have so many notes here. What you had stuff about rich man and Lazarus. Amazing. He's not talking about a rich man. Well, he is, but he's anyways. Read the book.
My
Get the
wife,
book.
my wife just passed me a note that says prosbul. So I think she wants me to mention that
Yes.
the temple was also a bank, but it was a crooked bank in the sense that the temple was used as part of a kind of a legal loophole to get past the debt forgiveness laws.
To
So
make it mandatory. To
right.
make like tithing mandatory
Well,
and all of that.
that's a different issue. Tithing mandatory was a different legal revolution, but this one
Okay.
was, let's say that you owe me money. So I've got a piece of paper that says that you owe me money, um, but we're coming up on the 7th year and I have to release this, right? Because the Bible says I have to release the debt. And Hillel made the argument, well, that only applies to individuals. That doesn't apply to the temple. So the temple set up a little operation where they would buy paper, they would buy IOUs before the Shemitah rule would kick in. So I would sell that IOU, that paper, that credit note to the temple, and then you'd have to keep paying because I have to release you from debt as an individual, but the temple, the temple's above all
Oh,
that and beyond all that, right? Those laws don't apply to the temple. So the temple becomes essentially the loan shark,
yeah.
and with the vig running.
Yeah. That conjures images of harlots riding a beast. There's just that imagery going on there.
Yes, it's a very crooked bank, and it becomes the center of economic exploitation. It becomes the place where where most of the takers take from the makers.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Okay. Parable of the vineyard owner. We have the piece about Pilate and his history. Why it's not likely that he was a soft man, but we get that image of him in the Gospels, and kind of why we think that may be the case, economically speaking. Okay, so I know we've been going for a while, so I'll try to start wrapping it up. Was Jesus a Marxist? It seems like in the Gospels, you have, and you get this from the more liberal theologians a lot. Jesus was in the business of kind of conjuring this Marxist revolution, if Marxism was a thing. You've got the working class, the poor people that he's kind of rallying around, and he's going up against the big guys, the wealthy guys, right? That's the image that is thrown at us. But that's not Jesus's his game, is it?
No, it isn't. Quite to the contrary. Jesus is in a war with the nomenclatura. That's what you call the ruling class in a communist country. So he's in a war with the ruling class, who are men of the state, who have proximity to the state, who use the state for their own benefit. So it's hard to come up with a Jesus who was looking for a bigger state.
Right.
Because that's, so I don't think that makes it's, of course, it's anachronistic. We didn't have Marxism, but you did have populist debt revolts and tax revolts. So the closest thing to Marxism that you have there would be that, and Jesus was in constant conflict with those people. In fact, Jerusalem chose one of them over Jesus. Barabbas was an insurrectionist, and Jesus was going to name Jesus, by the way. Jesus Barabbas is his name. And then, and Barabbas, it's just fascinating theologically. Barabbas is Aramaic for son of the Father. So you really have two Jesus, son of the fathers.
Oh, wow.
In this story. And one, they both believe in an uprising. Similar word in Greek, Anastasio. Barabbas's idea of an uprising is a violent overthrow of the government and a redistribution of wealth. Jesus's uprising is literally an uprising. It's resurrection. His resurrection, then the resurrection of the world. These are two different, like every election, they say this is the most important election of our lifetime.
Every single one of them.
Right. Every single one of them. They can't all be true. And they're frequently, this is a choice of visions. Okay. The most important election of everybody's lifetime was in 33 AD. And it was when the ruling class of Jerusalem, which is really in charge of the process, chooses Jesus, son of the Father, violent uprising, chooses that vision, the Barabbas brigand vision, as opposed, which is revolution, not just a robber. He's not Jesse James, or you know what I mean. It's more like narco terrorists. These are people who are robbers and terrorists at the same time. It's part of the same proposition. We're going to rob people and use that to fund our revolution. And over here is a different Jesus who has a very different vision for the nation. So that nation chooses Jesus Barabbas and keeps going in that direction, and you get destruction in 70 AD. And then you have the other Jesus, whose message essentially gets picked up by ordinary Jews, not by the ruling class for the most part, and Gentiles, and then becomes the peaceable kingdom that's now lasted 2,000 years.
Yes.
So what's the economics there? Well, they were in the middle of a terrible financial crisis when this was happening. If you hold to the traditional date for the crucifixion, 33 AD. If you don't hold to that, then what I'm saying won't be true.
I'm not familiar. I mean, which one's the more common?
Traditional date is 33 AD.
Okay.
But there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of scholars with all sorts of views. The traditional date is, Jesus is born in year 1, ministry starts in year 30, dies in year 33. If that's the case, well, we have a financial crisis in 33 AD, a worldwide, Roman Empire-wide financial crisis. And Pilate was essentially backed by the banking interests. Pilate was associated with the equestrian order. So it's kind of like, if there's some favorite senator that some appointee to the administration who worked for BlackRock or Goldman Sachs, right? Right. So we had that kind of relationship where Pilate was aligned with the banking interests, and the banking interests were on the defense. And so Pilate folded to the mob.
Yeah.
And so anyone who's into political populism needs to read those accounts very carefully, because that's the mob that says crucify him to the Son of God.
Right.
So just ordinary common people can be really, really wrong.
Right.
So, but the nation essentially chooses Barabbas, and that's their vision for the future, and it ends up destroying them.
Yes. And that there's so many details that I think are coming to mind as we're talking through this that I'm like, oh, I need to go here. But I'm like, okay, with time is a resource. let's just let's slow it down. But I would just, anyone who's listening to this, get the book, read it. Short book. It might take you a long time because you're going to put it down and just scratch your chin for a little bit. But so the last thing I wanted to ask you as we kind of wrap this up. So I'm familiar with people like, I think you're familiar, Michael Heiser, who does a lot of like archaeological, ancient text studies and all this stuff, and brings it to the scriptures and gives it more color, those kinds of things. But one question I always have with that kind of thing is, how can a normal Christian get really comfortable that they're getting out of the scriptures what they should be getting, without having all these little details that seemingly are super important, right? And like for instance, do I need to be an archaeologist or a ancient historian to kind of get the most out of scriptures? What's your kind of pastoral advice to people who may be asking that question?
I don't know. I haven't solved it myself. I don't know. I can solve it for other people, right? I mean,
Okay.
I needed to become a little bit of an amateur archaeologist and read a lot of archaeology to get what I got here because I wanted it. But I feel stretched by that every day. How much time do you put in on reading these detailed resources versus your first line responsibility in life, which is providing for your family? Because you don't need to find all these little mysteries. Like if you read 70 times 7 and your application of that is that you go and you forgive somebody, you're doing
That's in
well.
line. Yeah.
You're doing well. I don't think I can give pastoral advice to the individual because this is not a solution I think that the individual can really solve. I think we need a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
We need a different Christian culture. And in that Christian culture, there would be material that you would be marinating in all the time. So
yeah, exactly. And that's a point that I wanted to highlight. As Christians, we're always learning from the scriptures. We're always getting something new out of it. We're always like you're saying, we're marinating in this stuff. And we teach our kids to kind of marinate themselves in the scriptures so that as they go through life, these things become more colorful. They get the meaning behind them comes out, it pops out.
yes.
And you get those throughout your life. You're like, okay, I've always read this way, but I understand more about what this is talking about now. And I think that's the beauty of the scriptures, that we get that. It's not just a read through once and you're done.
Right.
Keep reading because you're going to keep getting stuff out of it.
Yeah, I think marinating in the scriptures is very important. What I've noticed is I do guest preaching in evangelical context, but mainly in mainline context. And it's fascinating because in Reformed world or Baptist world or whatever, a lot of the preaching is, here's a verse from Paul, and here's my 40-minute lecture on the verse from Paul, right? That's the sermon, right?
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of those. In the mainline churches, I'm just going to say it, the sermons are often abysmal, but they have the lectionary. So here's an Old Testament reading, here's a Psalm reading, here's an epistle reading, and here's a gospel reading. And arguably, your typical mainline Episcopal or Lutheran person sitting in the pew probably gets more scripture in a Sunday morning service than the hardest, strictest Calvinist or the most rock-ribbed fundamentalist, who in essence are using often one verse as a takeoff point. Now, they might be right about that one verse, but what's happening is that people, I've met people who for 50, 60 years, they've just heard these parables over and over again. And it's interesting, when I'm in Bible church world, it's like, oh, how's that parable go again? It's like, we don't really know the stories of Jesus all that well. This is a point that Tom Wright has made. We know a lot about Paul, but then this Jesus fellow, well, thank God we have Paul to make sense of this Jesus who's kind of really confusing. When in fact, Peter says Paul's hard to understand. But in my conservative traditions that I've been in, we do not hear a lot of gospel text. Maybe your situation is different. In mega churches, evangelical churches, you get topical preaching, which is verse from here on one PowerPoint, verse from here, verse from here, verse from here. The theme is contentment, right?
Right.
And so there's not a lot of scriptural saturation. So no matter what's happening in your church, you can choose to just read it over and over and over and over again. And part of the problem is you're not going to understand it necessarily, and that's going to become a little bit boring, but you're also, something's going on deep inside where you're reordering your mind.
Yes.
But when
Yep.
I talk about marinating, I also mean marinating in scholars who really are trying to get deep into the text. So you've mentioned Michael Heiser. I think before this, you mentioned Peter Lightheart,
Yep.
James Jordan. There are scholars who are really creating Bible saturated communities and podcasts around them. So
Yep.
if you saturate in that, you'll get more,
Hmm.
right?
And it,
But if you're watching Joel Osteen, you're not going to get that there.
right. Right. Yes. And I love it because, a lot of these people who understand that will read big portions at a time, whole chapters at a time. So you get, the context, you get kind of the full feel of it.
Yeah.
I think I've heard in the ancient world when the church was just getting started, they would read whole books for their at a time. Yes. For their sermons or their kind of talks.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, like you're saying, now we've got pastors who will read like half a verse at a time and try to expound that, which it has its place. Yeah. But I mean, there's something about just marinating in the whole thing, letting that kind of shape you and kind of mold your mind. It's just that you can't really do anything. You can't study scripture any other way, really.
I find another thing that kind of helps is movies that are like literal presentations of the Gospels. Like, I don't mean the greatest story ever told dramatizations, but I mean, there are films of good quality where it's just, here's the Gospel of Mark, or here's the Gospel of John, or, Luke. And then you're hearing, and that's different than reading. And the Gospels were probably meant to be read aloud. So they're by heard. So I think in Matthew 24, let the reader understand, I think means let the lector, understand, let the person who's reading it out loud say, abomination of desolation. Let me remind you that that's mentioned in Daniel. So I think listening to audio Bibles and watching video Bibles, I think probably also is another way to marinate. Because there's a point that James Jordan makes. When I'm reading a book, I'm controlling it. You put it down, like you said, and you thought about it, right? You're in control. Stop. Stop. When you're listening to something, you're not in control. So it's a different mode. I'm not saying don't read your Bible. Definitely read your Bible. But I'm saying right. Multimodal listening is another way to marinate. Mm-hmm. And find good resources out there. There are good resources. And it's tragic because, I look at the top Christian thought leaders out there in the world, like the people with radio shows or whatever, Ravi Zacharias, or I don't mean to pick on anyone's favorite, John MacArthur. I'm sorry, there's much more biblical depth available mm-hmm. with non-celebrities who are just doing the hard work of learning Ugaritic or, learning Hebrew and getting deep into the Hebrew, reading archaeological reports. Yep. It's just, you got to look for them. And they're there. And that's what happened to me. I got this book because I marinated in other people. And for me, you mentioned Peter Lightheart and you mentioned 70 AD. The whole world of people who understand how much Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. N.T. Wright would be another one. There are scholars who say, wait a second, not all these things are about your personal death and judgment. And not every mention of judgment is about you going to heaven or hell. And it's not all about the second coming. Loads of this New Testament material are about the destruction of Jerusalem. Right. That helped. That was a shift for me that got me into the mindset. It's like, maybe the economics are too. Oh, yeah. Looks like they are.
Yes.
So I marinated in something and then just applied it in my own field, economics.
Yeah. And I love it. I think you've done a tremendous service to the church with this, just to provide depth, color to the Gospels in an economic sense. Like the way I think about it, you've given us like a handle, a quick handle to open a discussion in I call it meme culture. Someone throws out a quip and they're like, Jesus was a socialist. He liked to share all of the wealth and he liked to share with people and he was all for the poor. And what we normally have to do is we have to go into a Bible study, say, well, what's the context? What's the trajectory of the narrative, the redemption narrative, all of that stuff. But you've given us this handle where we can just say, did you know that Jesus actually only confronted wealth negatively with politicians and rulers and religious elite, but never to those who are providing value to society, wealth creators? And that you throw that grenade in there and it opens a door for a discussion. Where normally it was like, okay, well, actually, you've got to know the context. You got to know the backstory. So I think you've done a tremendous service. We're going to go into a quick little discussion off air about a thesis or a dissertation. No, we called it a thesis, I think, that you wrote about our posture towards the earth in relation to God's command for Adam and his posture toward the garden. So we're going to talk about that. But we're going to end the podcast here. Everyone go like and subscribe to the podcast. Get the book. Get it and read it. You will not be disappointed. So yeah, thank you. And like I said, go love God, love neighbor, and build something. Amen. Talk to you later.